for staying with us. This is the third panel, so I know that some of you might be tired, but anyway, this is a very important panel. It's the fifth time we organize the gathering of the TechAccord here in Davos with amazing experts. So today we're going to be focusing on the industrial leadership of IoT, which is a very big subject, especially as many devices are getting connected to the internet. So in the panel we have Alisa for another time with us. You were here in May last year together with Mark. And we also have another representative from Nokia who is coming. Alisa is from Cloudflare, VP and Global Head of Policy Cloudflare. And Mark is the President of Security on DX Technology, big experts on the subject of IoT. And in a few minutes, we will be joined by Nishant Batra, which is the Chief Strategy and Technology Officer of Nokia. So if you don't mind, if you want to talk, you maybe go somewhere else, because here the idea is to get focus on this subject, right? So I appreciate your cooperation to maintain as silent as possible. Oh, here you are. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Nice to see you again. Great. So Nishan is with us, Chief Strategy and Technology Officer of Nokia. So as I mentioned before, the TechAccord is, actually this panel is going to be broadcast, it's being broadcast by YouTube. And we have a very interesting audience, as we got something like 700 people registered through the channel, so big audience. So, as I say, tonight is the fourth Davos gathering of the Cybersecurity TechAccord, which is being hosted by WiseKey on our Wednesday events. It is a focus this year on IoT. WiseKey obviously is an IoT company. We manufacture semiconductor microchips. And the IoT business is totally disrupting itself as more devices are getting connected. But more connections we have on devices, more we are increasing the cybersecurity risk for those devices and any other devices that connect to them. So today on the panel, we will discuss about those risks, how we mitigate them with the technology of the companies represented in the panel, and some views about what else needs to be done, both on the regulatory side, as IoT is not necessarily well regulated internationally. There is a movement to do so, but it's not still optimal, and see how this is expanding. So I will give, maybe just to introduce the speakers, just introduce yourself, what you do to the audience, and then we will move into the moderation. So maybe, Nishant, I'll give you the floor.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Nishant, and I'm the Chief Strategy and Technology Officer at Nokia. It's my first time at EBWEF, and it's pretty crazy out there, but hopefully we'll have a good discussion on security today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Starzak, and I am Vice President and Global Head of Public Policy at Cloudflare. And I am also excited to be here today. I have done this before on these panels, but I agree, it's crazy out there. But I'm looking forward to the conversation in here.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Hughes. I'm the President of Security at DXC Technology. Been to Davos quite a few times, so used to the craziness and the snow, and last year as it was in May. So great to be here, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to move for our first speaker with Nokia. And as you all know, Nokia is a leading network vendor. Nokia products and solutions are connecting more and more IoT devices to service provider and enterprise network. So how do you see IoT as a major impact on the security on the network? What are your views on that?
You know, let me start with, so we're of course in the business of connectivity, and it used to be about connecting for voice, then connecting for data, and now it's connecting IoT devices. And we see that between 2021 and 2025, the proliferation of IoT devices on networks will more than double. 2021, we had 14 billion IoT devices. It's expected to go beyond 30 billion by 25. So this is a big challenge that's coming up. Essentially, as the world moves towards 5G, faster networks, in parallel, the world moves towards industrial digitalization, we now start to increase the sensing, the IoT devices out there. This increases the threat surface significantly. And here, now we have to think about how do you counter this threat in terms of preparation. And there are several ways you can. The first recognition one has to have is that most users are not security champions.
Yes.
And these devices are often used and deployed by users which are not security experts. And then because the threat surface and the attack surface is pretty big, there are possibilities of several attacks. One example I'm sure my friends here can attest to, when the Mirai botnet happened, and that led to a DDoS attack. And this is a big risk out there. So one of the things that now we advocate, of course, we need to make sure the networks are secure. Let's not just make sure the endpoint is secure. We need to make sure there is end-to-end security when we're building IoT networks. It's very important. At Nokia, for example, in Dallas, we've launched the A-Star Lab. And this is exactly focused on ensuring, that there is end-to-end security in these networks. And what that part is, we also need to make sure that the application deployers, here, we have to make sure that the default security profiles are very good. There's policies that exist in terms of encryption. There are policies that exist in terms of access control. And we need to make sure there is a general security culture that needs to exist for us to counter this increased attack surface.
Thank you very much, Nishan. So we're going to move to Cloudflare, Alisa. And Cloudflare has a new initiative around Zero Trust and for consumer IoT space. Can you tell us about this and how it aligns with growing regulatory efforts to improve IoT device security?
Sure, and I just want to emphasize the point and make it even, and sort of kind of put that in context, that growth of IoT devices already right now, there are double the amount of IoT devices in the world that there are smartphones. And that growth, as you said, is just going to continue escalating because what happens from IoT is that every user has multiple IoT devices, and that is only growing. So that escalation that I think we're seeing, I completely agree. I think that's in our future, and we have to plan for it. I think I want to sort of point out the two problem sets, and then we can talk about our solution and then the current regulatory structure that's sort of proposed. Sure. So I think what we see on IoT are two different things. We see questions about the IoT device itself. So thinking about the security of something that might be in your home. And when you think about IoT, you think about something like a connected camera. So now all of a sudden you have a video camera, it's connected to the internet. What happens if it's not secure? All of a sudden it's a risk to you that way, right? So that is on the user side of it. But the DDoS side of it is the other side. So you have an unsecured device, and now it can be used as part of an attack metric. So because no one's paying attention to it, because it's a cheap device, basically it can call out, what a botnet does is essentially it calls out to the internet, and lots of things calling out all at the same time can take a site down or can take something else down. That's actually what causes a botnet. So those are the two things that you have to think about that you can protect against. What Cloudflare has thought a lot about, Cloudflare is a network security provider, and we have a global network that we can connect to all over the world. So what we've been thinking about from a solution set are thinking about the controls you can do with a network. So imagine now you have a device whose only connection point, where you can put controls on how it connects, right? So the only connection point goes to the Cloudflare network, where you can then filter out both in and out where the traffic then it goes out to. So we actually proposed a product earlier this year that's based on a SIM, that's an IoT SIM, and the idea is that you can put the controls in the network space. So it doesn't have to be on the device itself, although, again, the more security, the better. The more you can have default security, incredibly important. All of those things, incredibly important. But the idea that you can add to the network space and think about it connecting that way and put controls in that way is just another way of thinking about it. And we've been talking about this a lot because I think we have to be really creative when we talk about security and IoT, because what you often have are cheap manufacturing. You have devices that people don't want to spend a lot of money on, so it's not the smartphones of the world that people are going to spend hundreds of dollars on. And so you have to anticipate what the potential risks would be and how you can mitigate against them. From a regulatory standpoint, I think one of the things that we're seeing we're seeing things like the Cyber Resilience Act out of the EU, which is really thinking about labeling and the security piece, making it more visible to consumers. What we would like, I think, from that space, from the regulatory space, is really thinking comprehensively about lots of different solutions. So don't assume that one is always going to work. Think about the network solutions as well, layer them on top, is really kind of what we're looking at. There are also sort of new frameworks. So NIST has a new has really looking at sort of frameworks for IoT, thinking about standards, and we think those pieces are important too.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. So we move to Mark. Mark is on DXC technology. You do a lot of work to maintain and integrate IoT solutions for large organizations in the context. What kind of work do you do to ensure that IoT security posture is prioritized compared to traditional security space?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first things first, when we get to the 30 billion devices that are going to be out there, they're not all the same. And I know that might sound a bit obvious, but there are characteristics of IoT devices that in some cases look quite similar to and have characteristically processing power and interfaces like human interfaces, almost a bit like smartphones or endpoints, all the way down to very basic sensors that exist on a network, but they have no interface that you would be able to interact with as a human, maybe have an API interface or just a network interface. And let's not forget that some of those very basic sensors aren't just necessarily sensors. They're also potentially actuating devices as well, where you have this curious mix of something very basic, actually controlling things physically. Think about, I don't know, ovens and temperature controllers and the like. So things that can have really quite significant problematic impacts if they are used in the wrong way. So I think the first thing is to think about IoT things as really quite a very broad spectrum. And therefore you have to think about them quite differently and bucket them as far as possible. I'll come back to that. But think about this, the device itself. We have to think about the device security. Alyssa and Nitesh have already spoken about what we can do with regulation to help actually bake in some of what I describe as pre-market things that need to be there to make the device in itself more capable from a security point of view to start with. Secondly, you then have the actual data and how data is potentially extracted and managed on that device. Is it characteristically a device that perhaps has storage? Not all IoT devices do, but if they do, that then comes with the requirement to ensure how you manage that and manage the data that's on the device itself. And then lastly, the privacy implications. Now we see this a lot in security. How do you deal with a risk that is incredibly disaggregated? Think 30 billion devices. And the power of IoT is often, in a lot of these sensors, is when you bring that data together, and then the data itself becomes very valuable. So a number of different aspects. We talked about Mirai and how IoT devices can be used as it was in 2016 in the DNS attack, and subsequently with, we've seen other threat actors utilizing similar type of bot environments. But think also about when data from all of these sensors is aggregated, the value of that data and the privacy implications of looking after that. So a whole spectrum of considerations. So now quickly coming back to, therefore, the strategies that we employ with our customers when they are heavily invested in IoT estates. So first things first, think about the characteristic of the devices that you're deploying. If it's a camera, it will be more sophisticated, probably with a human interface, rather than perhaps a sensor in an agricultural context, which may simply be there just to do a temperature type of sensing a piece of work. And let's not forget that type of device needs to be very, very power conservative to give it the longevity as they are deployed in the environments, the harsh environments which they work in. So think about the risks associated with those different types of devices and therefore tailor the strategy towards that. And the strategy really that we employ with our customers is embrace zero trust as much as possible from the outset. Zero trust has now matured to a point where you can really group these devices and put them into an environment, a network-based environment where you're still reliant on, perhaps we don't talk so much about this any longer, but it's still very, very relevant, utilizing network compartmentalization and network traffic to control characteristically the flows in and outs, but also to spot where there may be vulnerabilities that need to be dealt with in the IoT environment. So that's a really important strategy of getting the network configuration and also creating things like IoT network gateways, which I know organizations like Nokia and others do as well, which is really important in how you then deploy and compartmentalize the devices. But then when you have aggregated that and you control it through that zero trust approach, is then what we advise our clients is to really make sure that you're then monitoring that and looking out, where possible, for known vulnerabilities, not just in the devices themselves, but to how threat actors are exploiting IoT more broadly. So keeping your antenna up, employing those strategies, continually assessing how that works and how you manage the risk within those environments, and then obviously mitigating the risk comprehensively. I'm afraid it does come down to being quite busy and being quite nuanced in how you have to do it, because one IoT device doesn't look like the next IoT device. Very finally, Alyssa, you mentioned regulation. Some of the NIST 2088 standard series, I think, which is out now, and there's lots of iterations of that. The NCSC in the UK deploys them as well, are actually extremely helpful and very good at how do you deal with that knotty problem of something that could be quite a dumb device, but how do you risk assess that, introduce it into an environment, in a zero trust environment, but again, extract from it what you need in a safe and secure way without threat actors being, taking advantage of it.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very comprehensive answer. So what is the trade-off between the role of enterprises in terms to protect consumer versus their role themselves? What is the, maybe a question for everybody in the panel, from your experience, as you are in very close contact with the consumers, it cannot be only the vendor responsibility, right? But how can we educate the consumer also to take their part share?
You know, I think that's one of the challenges, right? I think bluntly, I think what you have, if you think about a product as having it all being externalities, a consumer, you know, if you're buying a device, you generally don't think about security, right? Sure. Until it affects you, it's not something that occurs to you. So I think one of the things that when you start talking about default mechanisms, default security, that is something to sort of fully embrace, because you want the lowest standard to be still relatively high if you can. So that's one component. I think from an enterprise standpoint, I think the important thing, I think that all of the things that we've been talking about, certainly the things that Mark was just talking about, are the idea of that you can do it as an enterprise. So every device, essentially the idea of zero trust in that model is that you know every device on your network, you know exactly what it's doing, and you control the path both to it and from it. Yeah. Right, and you've put in the controls, you've segmented so that it can't go anywhere else. You've actually employed those standards, and I think that if you start to do that from an enterprise standpoint, it will at least cut down the devices. Even absent regulation, I think that you are starting in the right direction. So that's probably the right place to start.
Great, Mary.
I mean, I can only compliment that. Let's take the first example. The hardening and ruggedization of the default profile is a responsibility that we have to take. We can't assume that there is expertise out there and everybody's going to be capable to manage the device on their own. Plus, we also need to make it simple for end consumer to be able to deploy and use the device in a very simplistic and secure way. There needs to be simple documentation available for the user to be able to manage this as well. But otherwise, I fully agree. Mark, if you want to comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, Nishant, and Alyssa, you make some really good points. So there is actually some good news here. There are actually now some real initiatives around how do we get beyond that ghastliness of the stuff that we've seen in the past, of default open passwords and all those sorts of things. So some very basic things which I think industry is now responding to, but we need to continue to push for more regulation there to ensure we have that comprehensively done, which is, you know, for example, things like I mentioned, passwords, but also the ability for devices, if they have the processing power to be running software, for example, because you have to think about this not just from a device, but also from a software point of view, as well as a network connectivity point of view. Is there the ability, for example, to make sure that software is up to date? And if known vulnerabilities do exist, can that then be updated, and can those vulnerabilities be addressed and patched? So there are some basic things which actually the list isn't very long. Do those and get those right. Get the manufacturers behind that. And we see some of those initiatives now through some of the well-known bodies that exist in terms of creating standards, that now is coming to pass. And that is not, and again, the challenge there is always, you know, through initiatives like labeling, which I think we'll probably talk about in a minute or two, Carlos, but also it's not just about doing it on a national basis. So how do you do that on a multilat, obviously on a bilat, if appropriate, basis as well. And we've seen things now happening on that. So if we can get to a point where we can assume at least that from a given point onwards that you have those basic building blocks in place, then I think that begins to reduce the risk quite substantially. Because again, a lot of these things, it's the power of the of just the sheer scale of IoT that makes it such an attractive target for a threat actor. If you can begin to erode the amount of stuff that's out there that is truly vulnerable, then that goes a long way to start to get on it. So I think, therefore, to answer the question, Carlos, there's a real important piece here from the, as I describe it, pre-market activity through regulation that is going on. But that doesn't negate the need for that post-market activity that I was just talking about. How enterprises now help organizations or enterprises manage those networks in a considered way, just like they have done with the broader category of ECD, enterprise connected devices that have been around forever, you know, laptops and stuff. But applying those same principles, doing the risk assessment work, and then putting the controls in place. So that doesn't negate the need for that, the first part. So I think there's both of those things, but I would say that the ability now for some of those standards to start really coming into play, which aren't particularly onerous when we think about it in security terms, is going to make a big difference.
Thank you very much. And governments are increasingly getting concerned about IoT device security. There has been obviously important hacks, and governments are looking into regulating some of that. We always look at the other sectors, like for instance, before you are able to put a medical product into the market for consumers, you have to go through an FIA regulatory approval. Is that something that is required for IoT? What will be the roles of governments and regulators on that?
I'm in the middle, so I get it.
Yeah,
I think. You know, I think this actually goes back to Mark's point. I think not all devices are the same. I mean, think about it from a medical device standpoint. A medical device could be very well be a kind of IoT device. Clearly, the standards for that are different than the sensor, right? Going back to the analogies that were given before. I think the key when you start to get into the regulatory space is that you don't assume that there is one solution that fits everything. And you really do a sort of, I think you're right, that the NIST standards actually make you do a risk analysis, really put you through thinking about what are you trying to do, what are you trying to accomplish, and how do you go about doing it. And I think that the most positive effect that regulation can have is making sure that that's done. So it's setting the floor, because clearly the default is always going to be an issue. But the default, because security changes so fast, you can't assume that's enough. So that's where it gets into the question of, can you update it? To Mark's point, is it sophisticated enough for that? Or are there other ways to sort of control access to it? But I think the key from a regulatory framework standpoint and the question of labeling is really making sure it's flexible enough to think about that variation and making it not just yes, no, good, bad, which I think is often the sort of tendency of what people think of when they get into the to labeling, frankly.
I mean, I think we're all three coming to a very strong, unanimous point. It's not one size fits all. There is a role that regulation plays. There's a role standardization plays. It's been cited. I mean, for example, standardization, HCS standardized, the basic requirements for cybersecurity for consumer Internet of Things. And that actually initiated from UK and CSA as a best practice and then became a standard. Standardization, regulation. And also not just regulation, which is isolated to a country, but it is broader than that. Otherwise, the device proliferation, that stops. We need it to be global standards, global regulation. Finally, we can't take the onus only to the regulator and the standardization bodies. There is an onus on the device owner, the consumer, and then there is onus also on the device producer from a default profiling and the hardening of that, and if possible, upgrading the device as the security requirements go up. So all of that has to happen. We're all agreeing. Mark, if you want to add something.
Well, Nishan, I couldn't agree more on that last point about updating and about, this is where it comes to the labeling point about, labeling is all very well and good to say here it is, but what does that go to and what does that label actually say, and is there something that is onward? But just coming back to the specific point you talk about medical devices, I think one of the things that I see a lot in security is where you get the application of technology in areas like, let's just say, medicine, because you talked about it. The existing regulators have been doing medical device regulation for decades, right? The FDA and the equivalents across all the other countries. They are perfectly capable of assessing risks associated with medical devices, for example, in the context of pure medical. I think the time has come now for security to become less of a very specific thing, and for organizations that are responsible for regulation in those particular industries to continue to up their game, because it's not like they haven't done anything, but to understand that they should be assessing these types of risks in the context of all the other risks that they're assessing all the time. Using the NIST standards to take them through the way to do it, employing the people with the relevant expertise to be able to do that. Because as I think I said before, the deployment, for example, of an IoT device in a medical context is just that, a medical context. So who better to do that than the regulator that is charged with medical devices, as opposed to a regulator that's more of a technical type body that is more better at dealing with standards, but then once it comes to actually the application of it, use the expertise that's already there. The more that we can do that, the better, just because of the ubiquitous nature. And actually why I think that is important is not just because that's where it should be done, it's because actually that will unlock even more benefits. And when we think about medical devices, the benefit of connectivity from IoT devices used in a medical context, we're only just beginning to understand how powerful that could be for a better place for the world overall.
Thank you very much. And what type of differences between categories in IoT devices? Some of them, as you mentioned, medical devices can put threat on your life. Others are more related to trust. You know, a device might be collecting my voice or my data. How you differentiate that in terms of regulatory approach?
Well, okay, I've got the microphone still. So again, it's about the risk. How do you assess the risk? Use the framework to assess the risk, and then the regulation that sits around that either is very specific to that type of device or set of devices, or it's again, it might not be that straightforward. It might be much more about has that deployment of that device, because it might be a voice recognition thing, can be used in a myriad of different ways. But has that risk assessment done contextually within how it's being deployed, and then the controls being put around it to create that lowest level, that as zero trust as possible approach to ensure that when there is any actual use of the device, that it's done in that only the way that is necessary, commensurate with the risk that the environment is deployed in. So I think it's less about getting regulation to fix that, more about getting regulation to create frameworks for people to be able to understand how to make those risk-based decisions and then apply the controls that are appropriate for that context.
And can you mention some agencies that they are doing this properly in terms of best practices?
So I think Mark mentioned NIST before. I completely agree. I think we both, we've all talked about NIST. I think we've talked about, I think what we've seen, the EU has, I agree, we've seen a lot of sort of good development of standards, and I think there has been a lot of progress on that in the last couple of years in particular. I think it's been a really good movement towards it. I think what we haven't seen yet, and I think this is where the EU is moving a little bit more, is a more strict regulatory structure, right? So that is where the Cyber Resilience Act comes into play. Obviously, standards, regulation, they look different. Standards are sort of voluntary measures, and regulation are mandatory. So it will be interesting to watch how that shifts over time.
Yeah. I can make an analogous comment. I mean, I come from the connectivity industry to start with, right? This industry is based on a very important partnership of industry, regulator, and standards. Wireless industry exists globally on common standards, harmonious regulation, and the industry acting in cohort with that. I think it's important all three work together. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, standards will mature, then adherence will come in play. But adherence is also, if the entire industry starts to adhere to it, you can't be the only one not to adhere to it, because then your product's not going to be sold. Yeah. And then finally, if it comes as a pressure from regulation, from a Cyber Resiliency Act, okay, then you just have to. But until such time, if the entire industry starts to agree on a standard, it starts to become default. And that's very important. And it has to be a global standard. So ETSI has started, we've talked about NIST, but it has to start becoming universal as well.
Absolutely. And this is an area where WISeKey has been working a lot. But what if there is increasing consensus when it comes to security capability for consumer IoT devices, things like no universal default password, and having a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy and keeping software updated are reflecting on over 100 different standards around the world now. If there is such an agreement, what is going to help manufacture actually implementing these elements with such a diversification?
I'll simply start by saying, if there are 100 standards, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not enough intent, money. The standards are diluted if there's 100. Yeah. That's why I said, I mean, there has to be some kind of global value of that standard. They need to come together, and there needs to be a standard that all can follow, versus, okay, for every geography, we need to pick a standard that we need to adhere to. So I think that activity needs to happen, absolutely.
I would add on those in particular. I mean, there's clearly, I think we all agree that there are a set of defaults, right? The baseline of security where you don't want, where you clearly, and I think all of the things that you just mentioned fit into that category. I think the challenge comes, and I completely agree on one set of standards. I think it's incredibly important, but I think the challenge comes from a device standpoint. When you start to get into that set of standards, it really is the question of devices don't look the same. And so how do you put a set of standards together, which is a risk-based set of standards, then it works. But if you start thinking about it as, hey, individual requirements, that is not going to be the same as a risk-based standard because your devices don't look the same. And so that is the key, I think. And I think we are getting to be much better at that. I think that's actually what the standards development process has been very good at. So hopefully that's where we'll end up.
Well, just to say, Nishan makes the point well, actually there are good precursors to where you really have to, CDMA and others where you know, the ITU and others have created standards, IoT over many years that actually do work. So there's good precedent here. Keep the floor, as Alyssa says, at the floor, try not to overcomplicate it. And we've already seen some good bilateral arrangements, you know, Finland, Singapore, I think it is Singapore, UK, others now really, you know, and that's just a couple of examples. There's many more than that. Really getting into saying, look, let's get that floor right, and then get the. So I'm hopeful that 100 standards thing is gonna become hopefully a thing of the past fairly soon, and we'll agree on that floor and get that done at least.
Absolutely. And last year, our Security TechAccord working with the World Economic Forum, Consumers International, and I Am the Calvary to produce a joint statement signed by more than 100 organizations from industry, government, and civil society, highlighting the top priority for manufacturers when it comes to the security capabilities for IoT devices. It then launched a resource hub online to support adopting this capability. What more can industry do together to improve IoT device security, and how important is this cooperation with the World Economic Forum for the TechAccord?
Yeah, I think it is. It's very important. It's a good initiative. Like I was just saying, getting that actually happening on a multilateral basis, making labeling, which we talked a bit about, real, in the sense that it's not just about saying this is what it is, but where can people go to find out more, and how can they understand if there's updates and other things required. So back to that point about the floor, that if a device can be updated, the manufacturer needs to be able to make sure that they're producing those updates, you know, not just at the hardware, but also at the software level as well. So, you know, lots of things that are happening we really welcome, and I think industry can carry on really, and certainly from our point of view as one of the large IT services, one of the largest in the world, making sure that we push that message into our supply chains, into industry more broadly, that we expect and those standards to be adopted and they manufacture in adherence to them.
I would add, you know, I think WEF is unique in the ability to bring together governments, industry, standards bodies potentially, right? So it's bringing in a lot of the players who you want to be in those conversations on really making sure that we have one set of standards. So you can at least start to shape it. That doesn't mean they're doing the standards development necessarily, but they can push the idea of the security baseline, which is I think what we've seen already. And then they can push the idea of a single standard, because that is where we need to go in the big picture. So I think there's a very important role for WEF, and we're happy they took it on.
I could say, I mean, there is also, it's not easy, it's a tough problem to bring within the industry IT services, security services, system integrators, point solution providers, security solution providers, network providers, system providers on one platform. Because this is not an isolated problem. It's an end-to-end problem that needs to get solved. And of course, there's the standardization and regulator. But all these players within the industry coming together, and that's a huge thing, because then we're truly solving the problem end to end and not isolating it to a particular point.
Thank you very much. The Cybersecurity TechAccord is going to be the 5th anniversary in 2023 and has a dedicated working group focused on IoT device security. Maybe for the audience and also for the viewers, What is your experience with the TechAccord? How the TechAccord is helping both you inside your organization, but also creating the right consensus around the partners on things that needs to be done and setting priorities?
So what I would say is that, I think the TechAccord is unusual because it is a group that is just focused on cybersecurity, and so it becomes. It looks a lot different than I would think a sort of trade group or even anything else. I think that idea where you can have a large number of cybersecurity providers of various kinds or companies that have cybersecurity services speaking with one voice is really powerful, and it really says something, I think, from a broader perspective. That's one of the reasons that we've been involved since the beginning.
I agree. I think simply put, the Accord is a step in the right direction, and it needs to continue. The process of maturization has to happen, which is happening. I mean, the fact that we're all sitting here on a panel and we're all agreeing, I think it's also a platform that exists. We need to this is an industry that we need to collectively create a platform for digitalization on the basis of IoT. WEF, the TechAccord, regulation, standardization, all of this need to continue to mature, because this is not going to get simpler. We've talked about the volume. We've talked about the possibilities in terms of the end consumer and the network attacks that can exist. So a process of maturization needs to continue. It will. And I think we will build a very good platform for future digitalization based on those.
Yeah, I'd just add that the TechAccord, again, as Alyssa was saying, cybersecurity focused. There's one thing about cybersecurity which I always talk about, the characteristics of cyber when you measure up the risk compared to other risks that many enterprises, many of our customers face. Now, large organizations face a whole load of risks all the time. Cybersecurity is often one of those things. Some other risks have this as well. It normally gets done to you, and the velocity, it happens extremely fast. You can go from a state of okay to a state of not okay very quickly, to be simplistic about it. And the thing we particularly like about the TechAccord is brings together like-minded, same thinking people where we can move and do things quickly. And that is important to us. We can get that, what's happening outside in, and you can then move quickly without some of the other convoluted things that exist in other areas where you have to go through bodies and this and that. TechAccord is fast, like-minded. We all have a common interest at play here. One person's threat can be someone else's risk, and getting that information moving quickly through with like-minded people, we find really beneficial. So that's why we're so pro.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to give an update, last May we met here and we discussed about the increasing cybersecurity risk at the geopolitical level. Maybe can you give us an update what happened in the last 7 months? There has been obviously very complex and difficult months, but I think for the benefit of the audience, will be good to have an update where we are.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things we talked about last year was Ukraine, and we really talked about the beginning of the conflict in many ways. And I think that what we're seeing now is, the long tail of the conflict. It's still going, and I think. I think one of the narratives that we talked about last time was the fact that there had been a narrative that there had not been significant cyber activity in Ukraine, and that had not been a significant part of the conflict. And I think at the time I rebutted it in some ways by saying that there was cyber activity. It was just it played a different way than people thought it was going to. It was much more a part of a hybrid conflict. It was not a cyber conflict, which is what I think people were expecting. They were expecting sort of big, splashy cyber attacks, and that was going to be the conflict, and that's not what we saw at all. We saw lower levels, smaller things, sort of intended to disrupt, intended to be problematic, and Ukraine was really good at figuring out how to address them with the help of a lot of companies, right? Frankly, and I think they were really thoughtful and they did a good job in figuring out how to address them. I think that type of conflict has continued, and I think that what we've seen is just really novel uses of networks, and I think that is that there's a future of cyber conflict or a future of conflict question that involves cyber that is going to look a lot different, and it's going to look a lot more like Ukraine than anything else. So just to give an example, and I can't remember if I brought this up in May or not, maybe it had just happened, so maybe I did, but we've seen rerouting of networks where the idea was you want to employ information controls, and so networks in Ukraine, as they went into occupied territory, were rerouted through Russia so that they could employ controls on essentially what was accessible. We've seen a lot of different things along those lines where cyber attack has just become part of the fabric of conflict.
Okay. I think I wasn't here in May, but I can say there are two things we haven't talked about today. We haven't used the word metaverse yet in this conversation.
It's going to be a roundtable after.
So we might as well set the precursor for the roundtable about that. But the concept of metaverse, whether it's in the consumer domain, the enterprise domain, or the industrial domain, that concept, starting with digital twinning, is also maturing.
Yeah.
And the underlying fabric for that is sensing and IoT. Yeah. And that also starts to create now new vectors and new responsibility from a cybersecurity and IoT security perspective. Yeah. So we need to be very aware of that. The second trend, and I wouldn't say it's the last 7 months, it's actually longer than that, but it became prevalent in the last 7 weeks, actually. The use of large language models, the LLMs. Now, those who were not bad actors there, they suddenly start to have access to malware. Somebody didn't know how to write code. They can get access to code. They can simply make a query, give me code that I can use to attack. Those start to exist now. So we need to now be careful as to how that technology also can equip bad actors to get more sophisticated. So I think, like I said, it's a process. We need to make sure we hold the end of keeping things secure very strong. And the technologies like large language models and the opportunities like metaverse will only make that responsibility greater for us.
Yeah, fully agree.
Yeah, I think, Nishan, Elisa, you make some really fantastic points. And just to pick up metaverses, I've just published a thing on, we have in DXC, 5 key trends for 23. Metaverse is one of them. I think, people are sort of thinking, well, is it just headsets and stuff? Not a bit of it. I think as we see tokenization of financial services coming in as well. The use of money in the metaverse is really going to take off, and we can see lots of interesting things happening there. And of course, that comes with that security dividend, negative dividend in the sense that there will be people who will exploit that. But let's not forget that's always balanced against the ability to open up new things, both at an enterprise and a consumer level as well. So it's always that risk equation that we have to manage, but undoubtedly new risks coming from there that we're going to have to be very mindful of. But I just want to come back to the situation around the conflict. I think what has really struck me about it is being, as Alyssa says, it hasn't really panned out perhaps as it was previously thought of, but it's that combination of partnership at often quite a low level that has been incredibly impactful, and it's an ongoing situation, ongoing defense is happening all day, every day, and those partnerships and that way in which the need to be able to react quickly through those partnerships I was talking about earlier on has really shown that is now potentially I don't want to quite use the word, but a way of working, almost a doctrine that we're going to see emerging for the future, which is obviously very different from traditional military conflict type of thinking. I think it's been incredibly enlightening, quite very successful, but we're going to have to really learn from that, embrace it, and recognize the fact that a lot of what has happened because people have come together quickly, because they've known people in networks to be able to defeat some of the risks that have been out there and turn that into the ability for that hybrid type of environment to continue without the potentially the sensationalist type of things that were headlined a few months ago. So it's been a lot more successful, I think, than many of us thought, and a very new way of doing things, which we need to reinforce, I think.
And I think it has also reinforced the mission statement of the TechAccord itself, right? Of cooperation towards a joint objective, which in this particular case is very clear, the objective. Yeah. So we have 50 minutes. I don't know if there's any question from the audience that you would like to, yeah, please. Maybe if you don't mind to introduce yourself.
Yeah, of course. I'm Alonso. I'm from Cloudflare. We started the conversation talking about regulations, about standards. Those things take time. For the people who are listening via video and here in the room, what are some things that they can do, tomorrow when they talk to their organizations, their CIOs, their CTOs, to protect their organizations and IoT in particular? And what could consumers do tomorrow to go protect themselves?
Want to take that?
Yeah, so if it's a CIO that's being spoken to or whatever, so number one, I think I said earlier on, conduct a risk assessment in terms of the type of IoT devices, what characteristics do they have, what can actually be done on those devices. That will then immediately take you down a route of the types of controls that you need to have in place. At the most basic level, make sure that those basic floor controls are in place around access, authentication, passwords, things like that. If there is some processing power and human interface available, then there is necessarily a need in an organization to create some form of a control point. If there is central control available, so then the updates and the like can be pushed to it. Create network compartmentalization that can then allow those devices to run in a way in which that can be controlled, and then monitor the traffic in those networks to then be able to then take that into the threat intel and the monitoring that organization has to then be able to then respond if they see something odd happening in the environment. So through compartmentalization and control, at a very generic way, that's what I would be advising. Of course, it's got to be very specific to the types of devices and how they're deployed. As far as the consumer side is concerned, I think we said those floor controls, consumers are becoming more aware of it, but making sure that they are in place through the standards that are beginning to take hold. I think, so those are the two sides. But from an enterprise point of view, risk assess it, create the inventory, create the controls, use the products like, for example, Alyssa's talked about that Cloudflare has, to limit the access. I always say, go down to that zero trust approach, keep the trust as absolutely as locked down as possible, trust as little as possible. That will then hopefully really protect the organization in the first place. It's where you have wide open access that the problems really start.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Sandra. I'm a behavioral scientist. And one thing I can tell you about users is that they generally don't update their passwords or any kind of security thing until you really, really push them. So my question is, can the industry create an environment in which you essentially nudge a typical user who is not be doing all the updates that we should? They're not going to read on that, even if they have to, but they usually don't. So can you nudge the user by the technology so that they actually don't make typical mistakes in which they would expose themselves to any kind of risk? And then maybe a follow-up question, if you could make it a standard so that it's even like a smart standard, so it's kind of self-updates, because the technology is developing faster than a typical user can follow up on that. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Do you want to? I think we'll both have one.
The answer is yes and yes.
So I think on the nudge piece, I think the thing that's the most important is actually thinking about how you do everything you can by default. I think this gets back to that base piece. So you don't want the user to have to do anything. So you don't even want the nudge. You want as much built in from an automated standpoint as possible. That's automated updates. That's all of those things that can happen without a user having to do things for exactly the reason that you just mentioned. On the nudge side, though, I think there are amazing things these days. I mean, even from a work perspective, just updating software at work, we have software that is literally a nudge. It's a reminder that you have an obligation to update your software, and it comes and pops up, and there's an obligation. I think there's similar things that can be done on the device side, but I do think when you start getting into the consumer space, people ignore them. I mean, everyone in this room has actually gone through and just ignored nudges before. So really starting to think about security by default, imposing that from the baseline, and then doing automated updates if you're doing updates, thinking about systems that you can create that look like, that will do things for the consumer. Those are all the areas that we should be going to. One other just quick point, I think even from a consumer standpoint, I think people don't realize how easy it is to actually see what's connected on your network. There are ways of doing that. It's not actually that hard even for consumers. What we haven't done is do a good job educating, making people think about it. And I think there's more work that can be done there.
I can only agree. I think the first line of defense is not to depend on the consumer or the user to be savvy, because that's a point of failure in itself. Then, of course, in certain critical devices cases, you can actually not just nudge, you can mandate a secondary reset. And it can be periodic, or it can be based on some other point of inflection that the user has to reset their password. It happens today, and we can absolutely. The question of standardizing those is more based on the use, and it's more based on the application rather than a generic horizontal standard as much. On the enterprise side, where, of course, if we keep the starting point as zero trust, now we know that there is certain vulnerable user out there, and there's a policy of password update, but that gets ignored. There is also a possibility for that CIO to use access control mechanisms and downgrade that user. Say, you don't have the same access because you're now creating a problem for the entire network. So there is a possibility of downgrading the access control as well. So those mechanisms do exist.
Thank you very much. Any further question? Yes, gentleman there, please.
I actually have a somewhat, I'm from Nokia as well. I have a follow-up question to hers, and that borderlines the point where security and privacy meets probably, and the point raised was, we need minimum nudge to the user. Case in point, as we are here, I get an email which says, which cloud security vendor is right for you? Probably by one of your competitor. So, which is the point where less nudge to users from a security point of view is not sort of breaching privacy rights of users? What's your thought?
So question being, by nudging users, that's a privacy issue, is what you're saying. Yeah, well, I think, I don't see it as necessarily a privacy issue, but I mean, the broader question around privacy security is a good one. Just because something's secure doesn't mean that it's necessarily you're respecting the privacy obligations that exist through many regulations that we know about. So that's something that I often say to organizations when talking to them. Yeah, the privacy risk is there are controls within the security environment that help with the privacy risk, but it's not the whole thing. I think the question that you're saying about is nudging users to be able to move software along or doing that something which is potentially a privacy issue. I don't necessarily see it that way. We all sign up to the end user agreements. When it comes to software agreements, I can't say I'm the person who's read all of them. I don't know if anyone has in this room, but I'm sure there's something in there about that the organization has the ability to be able to do that. But I want to come back, though, to the broader point, which is Nishant talked about, what we talk about in the industry, very specifically around conditional access now as being one of those things. And Alyssa as well talked about the fact that there's so much that we can do now without having to do that nudging, with it just happening. So actually, the real solution to that thing, the problem that you outlined, that privacy security piece is, don't actually have the privacy piece in there. Just make sure that happens automatically in any case. Then you don't have to even go to the user in the first place and involve them, as long as you're making it clear from the outset that actually that is something that, as a software vendor, you are going to do, and that the user agrees that you can do, because obviously that is important, that agreement is there in the first place. But that's the much better way, as opposed to actually even having to interact with the user in the first place to get those updates done, which creates that standard flaw, as we've talked a bit about over the last few minutes.
No, I agree with all that. I think the other thing that I would say, I think one of the things that we're seeing right now, there is a question even from a cloud vendor, right? Where do you start? So do you have to turn the things on, or do you have to turn them off? And you may want to be able to configure, and it's certainly reasonable to be able to configure the way you want to. But if you can start from a place where the security controls are on and you have to turn them off, that is generally a better place for most users, right? So you don't want an open bucket, right? Not that I'm. I think it's really important to think about those as the defaults in the controls, and just think about the role that defaults play, frankly, for exactly that reason.
So, Alyssa, Nishant, Mark, thank you very much again for educating us and updating us on very important subjects. I think, again, as I say, TechAccord is a great ecosystem where we can learn a lot and where we can also act a lot. And I look forward to continue seeing you in future editions. Maybe as we're moving now to the Metaverse roundtable, just maybe if you can just join me to give a great wrap to